Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive where we tackle a topic that's, I think, really at the heart of what we do in ABA,
Yeah,
and that's verbal behavior.
for sure.
So whether you're someone who's just starting out in the field,
Yeah.
or you've been doing this for quite a while,
Right.
I think having a good grasp on verbal behavior, really helps make a difference for the learners that we're working with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you mentioned in your request wanting more practical examples and kind of steering away from all that technical jargon.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to try to do today.
Yeah, that's our goal, for sure.
So we're going to break down some of the core concepts, and hopefully you'll walk away with some things that you can immediately put into practice. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about comes from Chapter 19 of Behavior Analysis for Lasting Change.
Awesome.
So let's just dive right in. What exactly are we talking about when we say verbal behavior?
Yeah, so I think that's a great place to start because so often people think of verbal behavior and they think, okay, speech, talking, communication.
Right.
But when Skinner really defined verbal behavior, he wasn't thinking just about the topography. So not just, the words coming out of somebody's mouth, but really thinking about the function.
Right.
So what is the purpose of this behavior?
Okay.
And so he defined it as any behavior that's reinforced through the mediation of another person. So that other person is our listener.
Okay.
And so it's really that function. What is the person accessing? What are they trying to get or avoid by engaging in this communication?
Okay. So can you give me like a super clear example, something
Yeah.
that people can really picture?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say you have a child who's reaching for a toy, and that toy is up on a shelf that they can't quite reach. And the child looks at their parent and says, "Up, please."
Okay.
And the parent picks the child up, and the child is then able to access that toy.
Got it.
So in that case, the child's behavior, the up pleases, was reinforced by getting access to that toy because the listener picked them up.
Okay, so that makes sense. And so how is that different from, let's say, the child just pointed at the toy?
Yeah, that's a great point because pointing at the toy could get them access to that same reinforcer, right? But pointing is not considered verbal behavior.
Okay.
So that would be nonverbal communication.
Okay.
So it's still communication,
Yeah.
but it's not verbal behavior because verbal behavior has to have that listener mediating the consequence.
Okay. I see.
So it's the listener's action that provides that reinforcement.
That makes sense. And I think that's where, I know for me, when I first learned about verbal behavior, that's kind of where I got tripped up because, it is such a different way to think about language than what most people are traditionally taught.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think a lot of times, especially if you come from a background, maybe in education or speech pathology, those fields focus a lot on grammar vocabulary, the structure of language.
Yeah.
But in ABA, we're really looking at, okay, what is this behavior doing? And that's what's going to drive our interventions.
Okay.
So we look at the function.
Got it. Okay. So we kind of have, a working definition now of what verbal behavior is.
Right.
And the chapter goes on to talk about, 4 things that come before the behavior and then 2 things that happen afterwards that are really important for understanding different types of verbal behavior.
Right.
So can you kind of break those down for us and talk about why they're so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So these are really what we call our controlling variables. So we're looking at what is influencing verbal behavior.
Right.
And there are 4 antecedent variables, things that come before the behavior.
Yeah.
So first you have what we call a motivating operation. And that's essentially some sort of state of deprivation or satiation. So am I hungry?
Yeah.
Am I thirsty?
Yep.
Am I tired? Do I need attention? All of those different states that we find ourselves in.
Got it.
Then we also have our discriminative stimuli. So what's in the environment that's evoking this behavior? And that can be anything, from seeing an object to hearing someone say something.
Yeah.
To smelling something.
Okay.
So all sorts of different stimuli in the environment can evoke verbal behavior.
And I think about, like, even as adults sometimes, those discriminative stimuli can make us say certain things. Like you walk into a room and you smell something delicious and you're like, oh, that smells good.
Exactly.
Or I walk into a room and my husband is, making a mess and I'm like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
So I think as adults, we don't always think about it, but we're all, subject to those.
Absolutely. We are. And that's why it's so important to recognize them and understand how they're influencing behavior.
Right.
So we have motivating operations, we have discriminative stimuli, and then we also have audience variables.
Okay.
So who is the listener
Right.
Because we're going to talk differently depending on who's listening.
Of course, yeah.
So, if I'm talking to my boss versus my best friend, the things that I say are going to be very different.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have our own verbal behavior.
Okay.
So what I just previously said can also influence what I say next.
Right, right.
So all of those are antecedent variables, the things that come before the behavior, and then we have our two consequence conditions.
Okay.
So what happens after the behavior, and that's where we get into our reinforcement.
Okay.
And we have specific reinforcement. So that's getting something tangible, getting access to something, getting a break.
Yeah.
So all of those different things that directly meet a need.
Right.
And then we also have what we call generalized conditioned reinforcement. And that is things like social praise, attention,
Right.
those types of things. So understanding those controlling variables is really going to be the foundation for understanding all the different types of verbal behavior.
Okay, so let's start digging into those different types. And I know the first one that the chapter talks about is the mand.
Yes.
So what's like the simplest way to understand what a mand is?
Yeah, so a mand is essentially a request. So I always tell people, think about demand, like you're demanding something you want.
Right.
You're requesting it.
Yeah.
And it's controlled by a motivating operation.
Okay.
So that state of deprivation or satiation I was talking about, and the reinforcer for a mand is specific.
Got it.
So I want the cookie. I say cookie, and I get the cookie.
Okay.
So it's that specific reinforcer that maintains that manding behavior.
Got it. Okay, so give us some other examples, like some real-world examples that people can kind of envision when we're talking about mands.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, if you're hungry and you say, I want a sandwich, that's a mand.
Right.
If you're thirsty after a workout and you say, water, please, that's a mand.
Yeah.
And then in an ABA setting, if a learner wants a particular toy and they hand you a picture card for that toy,
Right.
that would be a mand.
Okay, so it sounds like if we don't know what someone wants, it's going to be really difficult to teach them demand.
Absolutely. So that's a big challenge sometimes in ABA. We have to figure out what is motivating for this learner. What do they want to work for? What are they interested in?
Yeah.
Because if we don't know what those motivating operations are, then we can't really teach effective manding.
That makes sense. And what are some other challenges that you commonly see when you're teaching mands?
Yeah, so another challenge can be when the learner, they only want a mand for certain things. Maybe they only want a mand for food or for their most favorite toys.
Right.
And so trying to expand that repertoire of mands and teach them to request a wider variety of items or activities can be a challenge.
Yeah, and I think about that even with my own kids sometimes. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, I know you want your iPad, but
Yes.
like,
Right.
we need to do other things too.
Right.
But how do you kind of overcome that challenge?
Yeah, and so that's where we might start pairing those highly preferred items with other things.
Okay.
So, if the learner really loves to get the iPad, maybe we pair access to the iPad with playing with a different toy. And so we're starting to build some reinforcement history for those other items so that they can eventually become motivating operations on their own.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Another challenge can be if the thing that the learner wants isn't available.
Right.
So let's say they want to go outside, but it's raining.
Yeah.
So how do you reinforce that mand when you can't actually give them access to that thing right then?
Right.
So sometimes we might teach them to mand using, picture exchange systems or sign language
Okay.
as a way to kind of bridge that gap. And then other times, we might reinforce with a verbal, yes, we'll go outside later.
Got it.
And so we're still reinforcing that mand, even though we can't provide that reinforcer in that exact moment.
Right.
And then also we use a lot of what we call incidental teaching,
Okay.
where we're really capitalizing on naturally occurring motivating operations. So if the learner is reaching for something or showing interest in something,
Yeah.
that's our opportunity to prompt them to mand for it.
Right. Catch them in the moment. Okay, so mands are all about requesting. Now, the next type of verbal operant that the chapter talks about is the tact.
Yes.
What is the tact?
Yeah. So a tact is essentially labeling something.
Okay.
So it's a verbal operant that's evoked by a nonverbal discriminative stimulus.
Okay.
So something in the environment, and typically a tact is reinforced by generalized conditioned reinforcement.
Okay.
So things like praise, attention.
So give us some examples.
Yeah. So if I see a dog and I say dog,
Okay.
that's a tact.
Yeah.
The dog is the nonverbal stimulus.
Yeah.
That's evoking that response.
Okay.
If I see a red ball and I say red,
Right.
that's a tact.
I got it.
So it's really about commenting on the environment and labeling things.
So the big difference there is that I'm not necessarily requesting anything. I'm just labeling what's there.
Exactly. Yeah. You're not asking for the dog. You're not asking for the red ball.
Right.
You're just labeling it.
Got it. Okay. And so what are some of the common challenges that you see when people are working on teaching tacts?
Yeah, so one challenge can be making sure that it's truly a tact and not a mand.
Yeah.
So sometimes, a learner might say cookie every time they see a cookie.
Right.
But they're saying cookie because they want the cookie.
Right. They want you to give them the cookie.
Exactly. Yeah. So in that case, that would be more of a mand.
Okay.
So we really want to make sure that when we're teaching tacts, that the learner is labeling it even when they don't necessarily want it in that moment.
Okay.
So we might have to do some things like, present the item and then immediately remove it.
Right.
And then ask them to tact it so that we know they're not just requesting it.
Got it. Okay.
Another challenge can be making sure that the reinforcement is truly generalized.
Okay.
We don't want the learner to only tact for a specific person or in a specific setting.
Right.
So we really want to make sure that we're providing that reinforcement intermittently.
Yeah.
And then across different settings with different people.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think another challenge that I've, seen come up with tacts is, okay, we're teaching them to label the dog or label the ball, but then how do we get them to tact more complex things?
Yeah, that's a great point. So, we want to move beyond just labeling those concrete objects to teaching, features,
Right.
functions,
Right.
classes.
Yeah.
So instead of just saying dog, can we say big dog, brown dog?
Right.
Can we say the dog is running?
Right.
So really expanding those tacts to be more descriptive
Got it.
and really, help the learner to understand the world around them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Okay, so we've talked about mands, which are requests. We've talked
Yeah.
about tacts, which are labeling things.
Yeah.
The next one on the list is echoic.
Yes.
So what is echoic behavior?
So echoic behavior is essentially repeating what you hear.
Okay.
So think about it like an echo.
Yeah.
You say something, I say it back.
Okay.
And it has what we call point-to-point correspondence. So all of the sounds match up. So if you say ball, the learner says ball.
Got it.
So it's just that simple repetition.
Okay, and this is a really important skill for, building other verbal behavior.
Absolutely. It's often one of the first things that we teach when we're working on verbal behavior
Okay.
because it really helps to establish that foundation for those other more complex verbal operants.
Got it.
So we can use echoics to teach new words. We can use them to teach, different sounds.
Yeah.
And it really helps to kind of build that repertoire.
Okay, so what are some of the strategies that are used to teach echoic behavior?
Yeah. So typically we'll start by modeling the sound or the word,
Right.
and then we'll reinforce any attempt to imitate.
Okay.
And then we gradually shape those responses to be more and more accurate.
So if we're trying to teach the word ball, we might start with just the B sound.
Exactly, yeah. So we might start with just the B sound, and then we might reinforce ball,
Yeah.
and then eventually, the full word ball.
Got it.
And we'll use different prompts. We might show the learner how to move their mouth.
We might use, visual aids, and then as the learner starts to get it, we'll gradually fade those prompts until they're able to echo independently.
And what happens if a learner has difficulty, like physically making the sounds?
Yeah, that's a common challenge that we see. So in those cases, we might focus on just approximating the sound.
Okay.
So reinforcing any attempt that's closer to the target sound. We might use visual aids like pictures of mouth positions.
Right.
And if vocal imitation is really difficult, then we might consider using AAC.
Okay.
So that the learner can still participate in those echoic activities.
That makes sense. Okay, so echoics are repeating what we hear. The last of the four main verbal operants is intraverbal.
Yes.
This one, I feel like when I was learning about it, was the most abstract.
Yeah, it definitely can be.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more complex
Yeah.
than the other ones, but essentially an intraverbal is a verbal response that's controlled by another verbal stimulus,
Okay.
but it doesn't have point-to-point correspondence,
Okay.
like an echoic.
Right. So think of it as like a conversation.
Yeah.
Or answering questions.
Okay.
Filling in the blank.
So give us some examples.
Yeah. So if I say twinkle, twinkle, little, and the learner says star,
Okay.
that's an intraverbal.
Okay.
If I say, what do you eat with, and the learner says spoon,
Got it.
that's an intraverbal.
Okay.
So it's a response to a verbal stimulus, but it's not just repeating what I said.
Right.
It's a different response.
Okay. Got it.
That's related to that stimulus.
Okay. So this is really important for, having conversations back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. Intraverbals are really the foundation for conversation, for being able to, share information, answer questions, tell stories.
Right.
All of those things really rely on intraverbal behavior.
Yeah.
And they're also really important for academic skills, so being able to answer comprehension questions,
Right.
participate in class discussions.
Yeah.
All of those things really rely on strong intraverbal skills.
And what are some of the challenges that come up when you're working on teaching intraverbals?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge with intraverbals is that they're not always as clear-cut as some of the other verbal operants.
Okay.
So, with a Mand, it's very clear the learner wants the cookie. They say cookie, they get the cookie.
Right.
With a Tact, they see the dog. They say dog.
Right.
It's very clear what the antecedent is and what the consequence is.
Yeah.
But with intraverbals, it can be a little bit more abstract.
Okay.
So, if I say, what's your name? And the learner says their name.
Right.
There's not really a concrete object or event
Right.
that's controlling that response. It's really about that association between those words and those concepts.
Right.
So that can make it a little bit more challenging to teach.
And so what are some things that, teachers or therapists can do to kind of help learners who are struggling with intraverbals?
Yeah, so there are lots of different strategies that we can use. We might start with, really simple fill-in-the-blank activities. Okay.
So twinkle, twinkle, little blank.
Right.
And then gradually move towards more open-ended questions.
Got it.
What did you do today?
Okay.
What's your favorite color?
Yeah.
And then eventually, working towards having more complex conversations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've broken down the 4 main types of verbal operants. I think it'd be really helpful just to do like a quick side-by-side comparison.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So let's think about it this way.
Okay.
So with Echoics, you're repeating what you hear.
Okay.
With intraverbals, you're answering what you hear.
Okay.
With Tacts, you're naming what you see or hear.
Right.
And then with Mands, you're asking for what you want.
Perfect. Okay. That's so helpful to kind of put them all together like that.
Yeah, I think it helps to kind of see those clear distinctions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on from the different types of verbal operants.
Yeah.
The chapter also talks about functional communication training, or FCT.
Yes.
What is FCT?
So FCT is really a way to address challenging behavior.
So when a learner is engaging in some sort of problem behavior, hitting, kicking, screaming, all of those different behaviors that we see, we want to figure out, okay, what is the function of that behavior? What is the learner trying to get or avoid by engaging in that behavior? And then we want to teach them a more appropriate way to communicate that same need.
Okay.
So if the learner is hitting to get attention, we might teach them to say, excuse me, or to tap someone on the shoulder.
Okay.
Or even to use a picture card that says attention, please.
Got it.
So we're giving them a more functional way to communicate that same need.
So it's not about necessarily, stopping the behavior or getting rid of the behavior. It's about giving them a better way to communicate what they're trying to communicate.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about finding a replacement behavior that serves that same function.
Right. Okay. And we talked about Mands being requests.
Yeah.
So are Mands like a big part of FCT?
Yeah, absolutely. Mands are often a key component of FCT.
Okay.
Because, oftentimes those challenging behaviors are a way for the learner to get something or to get out of something.
Right.
And so teaching them to man for those things can be a really effective way to reduce those problem behaviors.
Got it. Okay. So what about teaching listener behavior, it seems like? Yeah. Being able to understand what other people are saying is just as important as being able to speak.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what we call listener behavior or receptive language.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's a really critical part of communication. Communication is a two-way street. You have to have a speaker and a listener.
Yeah.
And so teaching listener behavior involves teaching the learner to understand and respond to what other people are saying.
Okay. So what are some examples of how we might teach listener behavior?
Yeah. So, some simple examples would be, teaching the learner to follow instructions. So touch your nose.
Okay.
Give me the blue block. Those types of simple instructions.
Yeah.
We might teach them to identify objects when we name them. So if I say, where's the ball? Right.
The learner can point to the ball.
Okay.
So we really want to make sure that we're teaching them to understand those different verbal stimuli.
That makes sense. Okay. And then the chapter also briefly mentioned augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC.
Yes.
What is that all about?
So AAC is essentially any form of communication that's not speech.
Okay.
So this can include things like picture exchange systems or PECs, sign language, speech generating devices, communication boards.
Right.
So anything that the learner can use to communicate that's not using their voice.
Okay. So if someone isn't able to speak, AAC can kind of give them a voice.
Exactly. Yeah. And AAC can be so powerful for individuals who have limited or no vocal abilities.
Yeah.
It allows them to, participate in their environment, make choices, express their needs and wants,
Right.
and really, live a more fulfilling life.
That's amazing. And then finally, the last thing that the chapter mentions is the VB-MAPP and PEAK.
Yes.
What are those?
So these are both assessment tools that are used in ABA to assess verbal behavior skills.
So the VB-MAPP stands for the Verbal Behavior Milestones Assessment and Placement Program.
Okay.
And it's really a comprehensive assessment that looks at all the different verbal operants and related skills. And so it helps us to determine, where is the learner at in terms of their verbal behavior development.
Okay.
And then PEAK stands for Promoting the Emergence of Advanced Knowledge.
Got it.
And it's another assessment tool that looks at a broader range of skills, including verbal behavior. So both of these tools can be really helpful for, determining a learner's strengths and weaknesses in the area of communication.
So they're used to kind of figure out where the learner is at and what skills to work on next.
Exactly. Yeah, they provide a roadmap for intervention.
Okay. This has been such a great overview of, kind of the main points of Chapter 19. Just to kind of wrap things up, what are some of the big takeaways for ABA professionals who are working on verbal behavior?
Yeah, so I think the biggest takeaway is to always focus on the function of behavior. So when you see a learner engaging in any type of communication, ask yourself, okay, why are they doing this? What are they trying to get or avoid?
Right.
And let that guide your intervention.
Right.
Be systematic in your teaching. Make sure that you're teaching all of the different verbal operants.
Yeah.
So Mands, Tacts, Echoics, Intraverbals.
Right.
Don't neglect any of them. Make sure that you're identifying those motivating operations.
Right.
What does the learner want? What are they working for? And then reinforce appropriately.
Yeah.
Use a variety of reinforcers. Don't be afraid to get creative. And then don't forget about FCT. If you have a learner who's engaging in challenging behavior, think about how you can teach them a more appropriate way to communicate.
Yeah.
And then lastly, make sure that you're teaching listener behavior.
Right.
So receptive language is just as important as expressive language.
Absolutely.
And then, consider AAC options for learners who have difficulty communicating vocally, and then familiarize yourself with those assessment tools like the VB-MAPP and PEAK, because those can be really helpful for guiding your interventions.
That's a lot of great advice.
Yeah.
So just to quickly recap, we've talked about what verbal behavior is.
Right.
We've talked about the different types of verbal behavior, Mands, Tacts, Echoics, and Intraverbals.
Yes.
We talked about how to use FCT, the importance of teaching listener behavior, the role of AAC.
Yeah.
And then, those assessment tools that can be really helpful.
Absolutely.
So just a final thought for our listeners as you're going about your day-to-day work with your learners. Think about how you can apply some of these principles of verbal behavior, and what's one new strategy that you might try based on what we talked about today.
I love it.
All right, well, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive, and we will see you next time.
See you then.
Bye.